Living in the diaspora presents unique challenges for individuals, especially married couples, and navigating these transitions successfully can help to strengthen family relationships. In this podcast, we hope to provide women relocating to a different country with a direct and unfiltered perspective on how they can be empowered to proactively move to a foreign country with their spouses if and when the need arises in this 21st century. Welcome to the Help We Need podcast, where we explore topics that empower women and support their well-being. I'm your host, Fumike Moronkeji, and on today's episode, we will be providing support from a counseling perspective to help women who have relocated or contemplating moving to a different country other than their original home country or current place of residence. On our episode for today, we aim to tackle the myths surrounding relocation and help single women or married women or women in relationships understand what they need to be mindful of to ensure their marriage remains healthy and it's not negatively impacted. Our special guest is Dr. Taiwo Adewumi. Dr. Taiwo Adewumi is a practicing child and adolescent psychiatrist with over 2 decades of experience working in the United Kingdom. Dr. Taiwo provides counseling for married couples and their families as part of a general and faith-based support process, and he is currently based in Dubai. Welcome, Dr. Taiwo. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this very pressing issue and, evolving topic of addressing concerns that arise for women and couples as a result of immigrating to a foreign country.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on the podcast there.
Absolutely, and thank you too for obliging us and joining our podcast today. I'm deeply honored as well to have you with us. Okay, so first I would like for you to tell us a bit about yourself and why you decided on exploring the medical specialty psychiatry.
I grew up in Nigeria, and I recall as a child, I had significant family members who had significant challenge in mental health and severe illnesses like schizophrenia and other severe things. So it was something I was always mindful of. I just grew around it, and it was just normal because it was all around me. I had aunties, uncles, cousins, at different times, people presenting what looked like. We had a lot of epiphanics and people, on my way to school, people who lived on the streets. And so it was just something you just saw it as a part of life. But especially when it came very close, I began to observe that very closely and saw the impact of mental health disorders on people, and sometimes how it could affect them so significantly that the downward trend. Some people cope with it, some people their life completely spirals and they can't look after themselves. So when I was interested in and I was interested in doing medicine, so the other aspect of it also was I go to church a lot when I was growing up, and I was in a church where there was a lot of spiritual emphasis and a lot of prophetic and supernatural stuff. And I was always mindful that a lot of mental health issues was seen as spiritual and something you have to pray and do, different, either through church or mosque or even traditional. I saw all of that. So for me, when I got to medical school, and I was interested in them, I was curious about it. So when I got into medical school, and then I realized, did my first psychiatric posting, it kind of really brought it to 40 minutes. I'm thinking, this was a lot of things that I used to see growing up. And to then realize that actually there are some understanding and things that could help, things that could make the difference, and that all of them are not necessarily spiritual as we put it, but that are actually practical wisdom and guidance that can actually make the difference for people's life. And so for me, that was really where my curiosity grew, and then I just gave myself to it. And I enjoy, I enjoy speaking. I enjoy the aspects of coming alongside people, getting to understand what's going on for them. But just knowing that practical wisdom and insight can make a huge difference to people's emotional, physical, mental, spiritual health, for me, was a real eye-opener, and something that, and then to realize I can still combine that with my passion in medicine by doing something like child psychiatry. For example, in child and adolescent psychiatry, you're constantly talking about systems. So you're not just collocating the problem in the child. So you see two children with exactly the same symptoms and the same problems, but living in two different environments. And you see one of them have a positive trajectory and can cope and can get better and do well. And another one completely, becomes dysfunctional, not just because of the problem the child has, but also because of the system in which that child is operating. So just this various multi-layers for me was really, really helpful, and being able to go there and influence and affect and bring wisdom and insight. Yeah, for me, really, that was where my interest in psychiatry and then subsequent practice in child and adolescent psychiatry and intellectual disability and working with systems. And as part of working with systems, then you've got to deal with families, you've got to deal with couples, you've got to deal. So that whole systemic outlook and how systems actually can have a direct or indirect impact on health one way or the other was part of the things that have really endeared me to, this practice. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's a very beautiful, I don't want to say story, but that's what it is to me, that you've shared in terms of how you've observed your environment, and your curiosity has led you further into the medical specialty of psychiatry. And just also, I love the word you used around systemic, because we don't live in isolation, right? And these things are, use or control or impact the way we behave. So yeah, it sounds very, very interesting. But thank you for sharing your story, and I hope our listeners obviously have enjoyed how you walked us through connecting the dots as well. So let's get started, I guess. So I'm just gonna go on to our first question for today, and the question's around, obviously our topic is the diaspora moving. It's around basically relocating to a foreign country, and that kind of creates an excitement, right? But in line with the excitement, it's also could be quite daunting at the same time, given that there are potentials and there are challenges that people often experience when they move from one country to another. So, in your experience as a psychiatrist, what role as therapy or counseling, what role has that played to make the transition easier for couples maybe that you support, and how has that helped them?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful question, and I think it may be helpful to start by putting that in context, particularly if I'm speaking to a lot of my diasporan, colleagues and people, particularly people who have come from either Africa or other parts of the world. And I can speak in particular like Nigeria, just to use that as an example. And one of the things I'm always very careful, because oftentimes when we talk about counseling and therapy, people think, oh, that's maybe sort of a very Western thing, or that's something that is maybe not akin to our culture, or that's not something we do, which can then make people feel a bit, do I really want to go into counseling and therapy? And when we're talking about counseling and therapy, we're basically, let's be clear, we're talking about understanding, bringing in professional help that helps people to think about how they can be supported and how they can deal with problems and life issues. And so we're talking about resolving problematic behaviors, we're talking about beliefs, we're talking about feelings, relationship issues, and even sometimes our somatic responses. And when we talk about therapy or we talk about counseling, oftentimes counseling is talking about, meeting with somebody who is looking at specific areas, whereas therapy can be a bit more further exploratory and all of that. And it can either be something that is maybe short term, where it's just like a couple of sessions and deal with something specific, or it could be maybe a bit more long term, exploring different things and trying to look at that. And so it could be specific area, it could be something a bit more, intense and looking back at things. But what I like to remember, and this is the way I approach them, when people are particularly thinking, is this something I remind people that let's go back to our culture and the way we were brought up, traditional culture. And I know, yes, there's globalization, but when you look back at African culture, and I remember I grew up in Nigeria before I came over to the UK, in my 20s, there is a natural, constant interactions between different generations, different people, and there is a lot of informal counseling and informal therapy that's constantly going on. So for example, you look at women, when women have children, the whole concept of your mother-in-law coming to stay with you, or your mother coming to stay with you, or an older person, or your grandmother or somebody like that coming to you, it's part of recognizing that as a young mother, you may not necessarily have all the knowledge or the understanding or the expertise or the wherewithal to be able to manage that transition. So somebody else who has had the experience, somebody else who knows a bit more about what you're doing, coming alongside you, working alongside you, can really be helpful. So therefore you grow in your confidence, you grow in your appreciation of what you need to do, and it feels less overwhelming. And it just looks like they're staying with you, but in practice, in reality, they are offering you a form of counseling. For example, it's like, I remember a very practical example when kids, when children are born, and I remember in Yoruba culture, they say, oh, you need to give them a proper bath so that they don't develop skin. And then when you're giving them their bath, how do you massage them? What do you do? And you get worried and like, this child looks so fragile. And I remember grandparents coming in actually when my cousins and nephews were born, and then they show you what to do, how to do it, and and all these things, and you just take that and just learn that. That's a form of counseling. It's a form of informal counseling because it's goal oriented. How do I birth my child properly? How do I make sure I'm doing things that help their motor? Even things like even how you feed the baby, what you feed the baby, and different things like this. And sometimes also you sit down and talk about, much more deeper things, in bringing you up. How do you treat a woman well? How do you, a lot of mothers, I could remember even growing up, they're talking to my twin sister and making comment about how you look after the house or you do things. So in many informal ways, we constantly engaging, if you're people of faith, most of our faith-based facilities are constantly talking about advice or counsel or collaboration, either one-on-one or almost like in a group session. A lot of teachings, you go to marriage seminars, you go to all of these things. These are informal ways in which you're receiving some information and teachings outside of yourself, which you can incorporate and use that as part of what you do. So I want us to establish that fact that actually we're completely immersed in counseling and therapy in one form or the other. So when you look at it from the perspective, then when you come out of that situation where you have all of those natural things working for you, and you come abroad or you come into a culture where you're completely now separated from your family, friends, and everything is new, and you're expected to then just navigate life on your own, a lot of those normal things that help and support you, that help you to be able to navigate that, you're missing that. And so sometimes that could present difficulties or could present problems, and you may then need the support and need the help, particularly if you're isolated. If you've come into a place where you have the same connections or you're able to get people to come around to support you, it might not be as evident. But some people in their relocation, they're going to maybe places where they're just on their own, they don't have the same networks, or they're in that stage of life where they need things immediately that they cannot access, and therefore they can get overwhelmed and feel really that things are not going well. Then in that case, stepping into therapy, and because these are ways in which it's been formalized in the West, where the same help and advice are coming to you from people who have an understanding and an insight about that particular area you're dealing with, whether it's your mental health, whether it's about your well-being, whether it's stress or bereavement or marriage issues or stress at your work, whatever it is. These are people who have spent some time to learn and acquire some expertise and understanding in that, then bringing that to give you a bit of that reflection and help you to take that so that hopefully you can navigate that well. So once we understand that, then we can understand why sometimes, particularly when we're transiting into new environments where you may not necessarily understand the culture as well or understanding the nuances. I give, for example, I remember like when I go to working in the UK, you have health visitors. And the role of the health visitors, when you have a baby, is they come in and they basically used to do what our grandparents will have done back in Nigeria, where the health visitor will come and check on you. Are you comfortable with giving your child a bath? Are you comfortable with the feeding? Are you okay? It's all the things. They will check the weight, check the height, check with you. Are you nursing well? Are you breastfeeding well? All the kind of practical things that almost like your mom or your grandparents might have given to you informally. You get it now, but it's done through a formal process because a lot of the stuff here are done formally. Yeah, and so you see some people think, why does the health visitor want to come into my house? That's intrusive. Why do they want to come and see me? I don't need any, But actually, you do need it because you used to get that informally, and now this is the way. So again, just understanding that. So in that context, when we come to therapy, I don't want us to see it necessarily as something completely alien and foreign, but it's any opportunity to get a bit of insight, to get a bit of objectivity into a challenging situation that will then give you hopefully the tools you need to make better decisions and get on top of things. For me, I think that's what it is. And I think hopefully if we see it in that context, then we'll be willing to receive it whichever way it comes. So just as we will have received it naturally in our context because it comes informally and it just comes that way. So just the fact that it's formal now does not detract from the importance and the significance of it. And if that's the only way it's available in this new context in terms of your relocation, then just see it as part of your natural process, and that you can take and use it whenever you need it. It does not diminish you. It does not mean you're inferior, you're not capable. It's just something you need to help you in your journey, and you might need, some people need a lot of it depending on the situation. So I would say some people need less of it. Engage with it and use it to the best of your abilities. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm trying to say there.
Absolutely. I like the way you projected it from the African culture. Obviously, you use Nigeria because that's your upbringing, that's a place where you grew up and your background. But I love the way you used, it's already ingrained in the culture of our people. And you've cited examples where informally, obviously, you talked about a woman that's just put to bed, having a mom come over to help take care of the child. That's also well counseling. And that's a different, sometimes we don't look at it from that angle, but those are informal ways through which we are guided, we're supported by our family members, by people, our aunts, uncles, by even our neighbors. So it also helps to demystify this cloud around, there's too much hype around counseling and therapy and what have you. So that's helpful, and I think for me that's really interesting. And you've talked about isolation. So typically when people move to a new country, I think the key there is the isolation aspect of it, and that's where things begin to get a bit of a rough and tumble, if you allow me to use that word. But if they do have a support system, if they have a support framework, then maybe it's easier for them. So yeah, very helpful to see it in a different light, in the sense that our culture embraces therapy as it is, and just is a new way of looking at things where we're guided and we're able to make better and informed decisions. So thank you so much for that perspective. And I know you've touched a bit about this, but we're in the real world, right? So not everybody is still into this counseling or therapy thing because they see it, unfortunately, as intrusive. So depending on the culture, you grow up in, I mean, most men and women, at least from where I grew up, and we have that same background, often still see therapy or counseling, it's a Western culture, not necessarily for me. So I'm just keen to get your perspective in terms of how women on the podcast should be looking out for this perspective in terms of how counseling, how therapy can help them when they move to a new location. And I mean, you've said quite a bit, but just basically, what would be a guide or a roadmap that you would put out there from your experience and your profession that women can just take a step back and think for themselves, okay, these are good things to do, and these are good things to consider as maybe I move to a different country.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, yeah, when we look at that, we need to sort of contextualize, because there might not be one size that fits all, because people are coming from different perspectives. So, for example, if you have people who have moved around quite a bit, let's say, for example, they've moved from, let's say, their home state, they've gone to a different state, or they've gone to university, and then from university they've gone into a different city. So they've kind of moved and used to the old idea about, disconnection from, a secure base, then go to a different base, and then set up, establish themselves. So let's say they were living out in the country or in a village. Just using the example of Nigeria, for example, you're living out in one state and you moved to a different state, or moved into a city where you did university, and then you decide to stay there, and then after that you're moving abroad. For those ones, that it's at least some understanding of what it means to be dislocated from your secure base, and what that transition involves, the planning and all of that. So for some of those, they already have some experience and some idea of what to expect and how that should go. And it's not too much of a shock to the system, in terms of knowing that when you first land, you're going to be cut off from everybody, is going to be isolated, you won't know anybody, and you won't understand what's going on. But so many people are in the same boat, and even people you see who seems to be well established, they all had to go through that phase until they got established. So it's not something wrong with you or something about you, it's just a natural transition that you have to walk through. So if you then start feeling a bit of the isolation or homesickness and all of that, you don't necessarily interpret that as maybe, oh, I made a wrong decision, or there's something defective about my character or my personality or my person. Before you come to that place where you're established, and then you become almost familiar with it, and then years back you look back and see other people who are just coming into the same communities, and they say things like, say, look, I get the point, don't worry, these things will go, you will not always continuously feel like this forever. There will be time when, so there's bits of that. So sometimes having a previous experience can be helpful. Sometimes it's different, of course. Not two relocations are the same, but at least you have a measure of preparation. Whereas there are other people who have never done this, and it's just like the first time they're going to do it. So for them, it's a lot more tedious and challenging, and it's something they've never done before. Now, if there had been a bit of preparation in kind of doing your homework, finding out a bit about where you're going, what are the expectations, what are the shared goals, are you going with a very clear-cut line of what you're doing? Maybe, for example, you're relocating where you already have a job, you already have a support system in place, or know exactly what your financial and legal situation is. Of course, that's quite different to, let's say, for example, a student who is coming and going into university. So again, depending on what you're doing, but at least having some appreciation of what are the expectations, what are the goals, what are the things that you can expect to see as you're coming into these situations will be really helpful. Are there any cultural adaptations or differences in terms of how things are done? So if there's any way you can get some information and get some opportunities to learn a bit more about what you're doing, what is different there, what would be the financial implication of this move? Are you going with a bit of financial buffer to be able to make that transition, or are you kind of going with very little? Because all of these things can affect your experience on ground in terms of the reality and the practicality. But more importantly also, what are the support systems you have in place? So again, understanding that the more support system you can have in place and will be really helpful. But know that that transition will happen to everybody. I remember when I first moved to England, people used to have that phrase that, England is a leveler, because you suddenly realize it doesn't matter what you've done or what you've done. When you come here, there are just some things where for everybody's going back to ground zero, and then you start to build from there, irrespective of whatever level you come into it. Dealing with the weather, for example, and knowing fully well how you're going to prepare yourself, how to dress warmly and dress something even as simple as basic as that. You go out and you're not prepared, and by the time you're coming at night, you're almost like, I want to go back to my tropical country. But then people tell you, oh, this is what you do, this is where you can get these things, this is how you can get. So even something as simple as that can make the difference between going to work and coming back not feeling terrible about yourself. So it's important to see, having clear expectations, have a clear understanding of what is there, and if there are support systems that you can turn into. Thank God these days there's a lot more opportunities. You can go online, you can, there are lots of blogs, there are lots of things that are available, but take the time to learn as much about this environment and what is specific to yourself. If there are opportunities to get in touch with people, particularly who are going through what you are going through exactly the same route, and who will have an understanding of what to expect, that will also be helpful, because then you can prepare your mind and know, so that if there are things you can do upfront, you've done it. If there are not things you can do upfront, but at least you kind of know when you're hitting the ball first. And if there are people there who can connect with you, then at least it makes life difficult. So it's really important to have a bit of that understanding of what you're putting yourself into. Unfortunately, that's different for like maybe people who found themselves, having to move either immediately or unprepared. And that's, that's a whole different ball game. And that does happen. But even in that situation, it still doesn't mean that there are not things you can do. Even when you find that situation, again, it's also still recognizing that even for well-established travelers and people who have all of the plans, these difficulties still arise. So yeah, you might have some things unplanned for, but everybody goes through a period of adjustment, a period of understanding. So cut yourself a bit of slack and a bit of understanding, and allow yourself some time and space to walk through and to understand. That's also important, because then that means you then be willing to engage and be in a state of mind where you really want to learn and take on information. So if you've not done your information prior to landing, once immediately you land, and try and pick up from that, but get as much information as possible to give you a better understanding. For example, I'll give you an example. I had a situation. I met a couple at work, and it moved to the UK, and it was working with his colleagues, and thinking, trying to be friendly and hoping somebody might invite him home just to get to know them. But nobody ever invited him home. But on Friday evenings, they would say, would you like to go with us to the pub? We're just going for a drink. But he didn't come from a pub culture in Nigeria, and it was very religious guy. To him, going to pub is like, it's not something you do. So every time he says, no, I'm not going to the pub, and then he's going on to think, these guys are not friendly, they don't even try to welcome me and everything, without understanding that for them, the pub is their social space. So by actually asking him to come with them to the pub, is saying, I want to know you outside of work, because this is a social space where we meet, where we can then get to know you. And then if there are things you need or any support or any help, they will be able to know you informally. Because in work is so focused, they can't really do that. So he's thinking, these guys don't care. They don't even try to help me or support me. Whereas they're thinking, this guy doesn't want anything to do with us, because every time we invite him to come into a social space where we can have this interaction, he just ultimately says, so after a while, they stopped inviting him, because they feel, well, I don't know, maybe he doesn't like us, or he's antisocial or whatever. And then another colleague came who suddenly went out, and then the guy came back and at the weekend telling him, I met up with these guys, they were able to explain this to me, they told me where I can get this, where I can get it. And then suddenly the lights dropped and realized, so it wasn't just, that was their own way of communicating. So that's, again, a very cultural difference from where they've come from to where they are. So having some understanding and nuances about how do people here interact, what are the social spaces, where are the wheres, people pass information, how do people interact, and even at workplaces, what kind of things are allowed and not allowed. These are important, differences that can help you to feel belonging and feel settled, rather than feeling isolated or persecuted, or even outrightly feeling people don't really care or they're neglecting you. So that's just a small example, but it's just an idea of letting us know the importance of being open and curious and willing to learn, and not just come in a completely fixed mindset, or just give people that benefit of doubt, and just be open to learn a bit more. Of course, there are things you might not necessarily want. It's not about embracing everything where you go. You still have your values and everything, but if you're open, at least you can make an informed decision and consent, and that might help you to be able to integrate better into your new space where you found yourself.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that example. It rings a bell in my head. Obviously, myself having to move, to where I currently am based, and I would use the word culture shock. And what I hear you say is, no matter if you're experienced or not in terms of traveling or relocating, it would always happen. It's a process, because you are learning a new culture, learning a new way of living. And that's something that's okay. So our women on the call shouldn't feel like, oh, something is wrong with me, or suddenly maybe give themselves, I don't know, diagnose it, but they're depressed or what have you. But just learn to understand that it's part of the process. And I think more importantly, when we talk about a roadmap or a guide, it's important to plan where possibly you can, when you know you're moving to a different country. What's the weather? What does that look like? Understand the way the people there relate. So that gives you some perspective, so that ultimately you get to know a bit more about these people when you do get there. Or you have information on your, at hand. And then you've talked about obviously having a support system. And that nice example that you shared about a person who obviously was invited by his colleagues, but because they didn't know, didn't explore the opportunity of just going out and getting to know people more. So I think it's helpful for our ladies listening in to try and get to know people and try and get to understand them. And from there, you get to interact and be much more connected, and they show you around. And I think one thing that also comes across is you can't plan so much. You can't know everything. And the people that live in that environment are the people that can help and guide you accordingly. So thank you for sharing. It's important you also have goals, right? You mentioned that. Try and adapt to the culture. And then your financial planning, you need to be able to think through these things, right? You're moving, you need to have some financial support, one form or the other. And then I think basically that's it. We've kind of summed up everything you said. So thank you. That was really helpful. So I'm moving on to our next question, and that would be in terms of coping strategies. So what you've said in a sense seems like that's a coping strategy, but in a sense, when the push comes to shove, like when it's really hitting home and people are struggling to make, the other time you said, you talked about the weather, right? And you're coming from a tropical part of the world. You're coming into a very cold region, and you'll be like, oh my god, I don't think I can survive another day. I'll go back, or you go back home. You need to continue to press in and press on. So I'm just wondering, is there any form of strategy that women on the call, on the podcast, can reflect upon and say, okay, if I get stuck, or if I'm find myself in this situation, these are the things I need to maybe consider or maybe think about?
I think it's like I said again, it's all contextual, but I think there are some general principles that are helpful, and in the context of the couple together in the situation, or even if you're a single person, in terms of your relationships within your environment, your friends or people around you, or in terms of your schoolmates or workmates and all of that. I think one important thing in terms of coping that I just want to mention that is important in making these transitions. It's always helpful not to disconnect from our previous coping and important things that ground us. So just because you're transitioning into a new environment doesn't necessarily mean you should disconnect from the things that helped you before. So if you've got a good, solid network before, whether it be your family or friends or things like that, actually keeping that and taking that with you into the transition is a helpful way to give you that buffer zone. Because like I said, it does take time in the new environment to maybe develop new friendships or even friendships that you feel comfortable enough to be able to share intimately and be able to feel, connected enough to talk about kind of deep and things. So holding on back to what you had before and being able to deep into that and use that. Yes, they may not fully understand even the context and some of the pragmatics of what you're dealing with. But because at least you have that connection and you have that sense of they have my back, they know me, they know where I'm going from. Even if all it takes, like you say, a problem shared is a problem halved. Even if you just to get somebody you can dump it on and they can't even do anything about it, but at least you're getting it off your chest and you think. So that's really important. So keep your connections. I remember like we used to, I remember when as a single person, I remember one of the very helpful advice somebody gave me when I was thinking about marriage. And it says, your wife looks at you and like, I want to get married to this guy. And it says, but you have to, your fiancé has to understand that what makes Taiwo who he is a combination of Taiwo's characteristics and the relationships that is built and helped him. So if you want to embrace Taiwo in a relationship, as much as possible, try and embrace Taiwo and all of those relationships. Because if you embrace Taiwo alone without those relationships, you might end up with a Taiwo that you did not actually plan for. Because Taiwo without those relationships might be a very different Taiwo from the one you want to marry. So this Taiwo that you're saying that you like and you want to marry him is a combination of himself and significant relationships in his life. So if you embrace him and those significant relationships, then you're likely to get that Taiwo in your marriage, and it's very helpful. Whereas if you separate him from that, you might actually end up with something quite different from what you had before. So when you're making your transitions as well, if there are things that you have in your life that are key and help you to grow, you want to keep hold of those things because they will be really important in helping you to navigate all those initial transitions and everything. And then coming into it, again, is just some of the practical things, keeping your communication really, really key. Like I used to say to people, there will always be challenges, but what you don't want those challenges to come in between you. You want to keep the unity of your relationships and keep those challenges before you. So you want to keep your line of connection very tight so that you can always talk and discuss about things. You don't want to personalize issues and becomes the person's rather than the issue. So separate the issues from your person, from your relationship as much as you can, so that way you can continue to leverage and support each other as you meet the challenges, because there will be lots of challenges. That's just the reality. Just because you've moved into a different situation, it might give you a different economic projection and perspective, but everything is a double-edged sword. That comes with its own challenges. You may be here now and earning a bit more, but you may not have the same social circle you had before. You may be at home where you had a lot of help and support in managing your household chores and all of that. You're here now, you don't have any of that. You have to, so there are a lot of positive that might come with it, but there might be things. But at least if you're solid and you're united, then you can walk through it together. So keep your communications as clear as possible. Make time for one another. Make time for those friendships, and protect it. Don't allow the stress and the situation of where you found yourselves now to rob you of those things. Are there things you do that help you maintain a good mental health? You're exercising, you're into sports, you're into, whatever things you do that help you grounded, and it's a place for you where you go and rejuvenate and rib yourself within the space and the realistic expectation. Still try and keep it, because like I said, it's important to make sure that you're looking after yourself in order to do that. And again, celebrate little wins, because like I said, when you come in, there will be challenges, and sometimes you can become so focused on the challenges that you actually forget all the things you're beginning to do well, you're adapting and getting into it. So be a bit self-loving, and when you make progress, acknowledge that, celebrate that, because then that gives you that sense of achievement and that sense of momentum, so that you don't become just preoccupied with all the negativities and challenges. Look at the positive and helpful things that are happening and try and celebrate and use that. And in all of that as well, if it comes to a point where it's really becoming quite inhibiting, like I said, if you have informal relationships that you can use to get some insight and some wisdom and some support, take it. But if it's not there, then seek professional support. So particularly depending on where the issues are coming from. If you're struggling with issues relating to work, most workplaces will have occupational health. And these are confidential spaces where you can bring issues relating to your work, where you can talk to somebody who can support you. Those people are not there to go and report it to your managers or go and bite and tell them everything. No, they have a specific role to help you do your work better. And so, you could be able to tap into that. If it's, things to do with your marriage or your relationship, you can take it into whatever space you're comfortable with. If you have, if you're a religious person, you want to discuss with your pastors, or you have an older couple that you trust and everything, that's really important that you try and use whatever resources are there. And if you have to, take that professionally. Sometimes I've met, especially in my job, I see a lot of families where a lot of stress come with the children. And the children are struggling with either learning difficulties or struggling in social relationships or just the transition, or the children have significant difficulties. And sometimes parents don't understand where school is coming from. And school is saying, just child is struggling, we need to refer them for this. I actually no, don't label my child, don't do this, don't do that. But then we have to understand that this is, again, I can use an example from Nigeria where, for example, I know in the UK where many of the schools, the resources come along with whatever. Sometimes for the school to access a report for a child, they need to go through a formal assessment where the needs of the child are identified. Then based on the needs of that child, then there are resources that the school can pull into to support that child. Now, if you don't understand that's the way the education system is set up, you just go to them and see parents busy fighting with schools because they want schools to provide, I can see my child is struggling. Why are you not just giving them these needs? And it's going to say, okay, can we send your child? I said, oh, no, you can't send my child for assessment. But you don't make the link that the way the resources follow sometimes assessments. That's the way the system runs. So sometimes when the school is saying we need an assessment, invariably what they're saying to you is the way we can link in those resources is to go through that way. And so you then find, maybe sometimes parents are loggerhead with school and it's impacting the child, it's impacting so many things, and the poor child is caught in the middle of that. But by having a better understanding of how the structure works, then you realize, okay, actually, and then of course that will be impacting at home because the child is stressed, parents are stressed, is now relating to parental stress, is beginning to cause conflict in their marriages because dad has a different mom has a different, and they're both just stressed. The child is they're getting phone calls from home, is disrupting their work, they're having to go and pick so you can say how it can just spiral and whereas an understanding that, okay, actually, at this point, I think, yes, receiving that professional help, being very clear what that is about. Yes, you're still proactive and advocating for your child and making sure that it's not just being labeled or a racist thing, but actually sometimes understanding the process, working with it. And if you don't understand it, speaking to somebody who is a bit neutral, who can actually help you know how the system works so that you can make an informed decision. So these are, again, literally two things that can make a difference and help in shaping how you are able to embrace this transition and hopefully as a family or as a single person. So for example, a lot of universities have learning support teams. And so you have people who have come in as students, they're doing masters or higher education or even undergraduate. The learning support teams are there to be able to support you. So I see a lot of young people who have developmental disorders like ADHD or ASD who have significant learning challenges. And the way this is structured now, they're realizing I'm really struggling here. I need help. I need support. But actually, there's a learning support services and you need to go and speak to them. Because only when you speak to them, they can then help you understand how the support system within that university works and what is the best way for you to access what you need. And so therefore, going to speak to somebody, so you have to, like I said, things are formalized, but sometimes they're formalized for a reason because that is the way into getting the help and the support you need. So if you need things within your academic space, understand how does that come. Sometimes you might just go to your lecturer and say, oh yeah, when I was in university back in Nigeria, I speak to my lecturer just directly supports me. It might not necessarily work like that here because they have a whole department of learning support. So it's not the lecturer's role to do that specifically. Why? No, it's not that he doesn't want to help you, but there is actually a whole team that is their role. And they will then make recommendations, which comes back to your lecturers. And then your lecturers can then put in those recommendations. But he cannot make those decisions because it's not his role to make it. So understanding how things work in the system, I've just given like two examples there, just as a way to kind of, again, show how that actually by just being a bit open and kind of trying to understand where we are and try and make as much support for ourselves as possible. Because when you look at the locals, that is what they take advantage of because they understand how the system works and they understand how these things go. So they can tap into it and use it to support themselves. So those are just few, things I just want to highlight I think might be helpful. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The two keywords I think I've picked from what you've shared in terms of coping strategies, and do not disconnect and be open minded. And to be honest with you, I think that disconnection is a trap that we often fall into because we move from one place to the other. We cut connections. I guess in our heads, or I mean, I could be speaking for myself more literally, but it's not necessarily I cut this. I cut the line. I think it's even the perspective that, oh, this person has moved away from us and people don't want to relate with you anymore. So I get what you say when you say when you're leaving home, don't stop talking to people, don't stop your network, don't stop connecting. But interestingly, funny enough, in my own example, I had people not wanting to pick my calls. I had people not wanting to exchange messages anymore because in their mind, you've left us. So what else do we want to talk about? But back again to your point, we shouldn't fall into the trap of disconnecting because these are the pillars that will still continue to hold us. These are the connections we've known. These are the connections we trust. And we should ensure that we still keep those connections to make sure that, at least from a mental, emotional well being, we have people to call to say, this is what I'm going through, exactly what you've said. And then the thing I loved again about what you said is around exploring, keeping the line open between your spouse and yourself, right? The things you normally did that sparked your relationship should not die because you moved to a different location. So keeping that connection is really important to support both of you as you go through the changes in the new location. You've also talked about celebrating little wins. And I think this is just a global, I would say a global issue because typically when life gets at us, we tend to focus on the negatives. And what you're encouraging women as a form of coping strategy is say, what are the things you've done so far? Celebrate that, embrace that, be proud of yourself for getting from point A to B, as opposed to really focusing on the things that are really stressing you. And then you said, if everything doesn't work, hey, it's okay to ask for help. Be open minded, see how things are done in your location, and seek professional help if needed. So, absolutely amazing. I love the connection and not the connecting and disconnecting. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Taiwo. It's been a pleasure having you on our podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been really lovely being able to speak to you about these issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So, there, women, relocating with your spouse is a shared adventure, but it's also very crucial to maintain your individuality and sense of purpose. So, whether you relocate as a couple or on single status, please keep in mind that you will need to embrace change to live outside your comfort zone as an opportunity for growth. For married couples, open communication is key, like we've learned today. So it's important to honestly discuss your expectations and shared goals in a mutually beneficial way with your spouse. You will also need to build a support network. We've also learned that today on our podcast where, we explore personal development opportunities and we prioritize self-care. And having some financial independence, even in small steps, fosters confidence and resilience. So remember, thriving in a foreign country is not just about adapting to a new place. It's about finding your strength while nurturing the bond that brought you there with your spouse or with your partner. And we don't have to get it all figured out at once. We can do this together, one step at a time. Thank you for listening to the Help We Need podcast. Stay tuned in for more episodes on living your best lives. And until next time, stay empowered and remember to empower.